Thank you for joining this webinar in Empowering Diversity, Immigrants in Clinical Trials. My name is Kathleen Geelan. I'm a program manager with McMaster Continuing Education, and I'm very pleased to co-host today's session and to welcome Mananza Jamel, Applied Clinical Research Program Instructor. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that McMaster Continuing Education is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I've just changed the view because this conversation will be fairly casual between Mananza and myself. Mananza, thank you for spending time with us today on this subject. When you approached me about conducting a workshop regarding increasing the diversity in clinical research trials, specifically for the new immigrant population, I must admit that I thought our program covered off many of the diversity and inclusion aspects, which it does. But in talking with you and reading your published paper entitled Bridging the Gap, I am grateful that we have this time together to discuss the needs of new immigrants. While many of us can relate to the challenges of being a new immigrant, either from our own experiences or those in our not too distant families, I'm going to frame this discussion by defining, as you did in your paper, Mananza, new immigrants being those who have been in Canada for 5 years or less. Can you start by telling us why the 5-year lens?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and I really look forward to the conversation today. And to answer your question, so usually it takes about 5 years roughly for individuals to transition into the citizenship stage in Canada. And so anytime before that, when you're in Canada, you're at the immigrant sort of status or the permanent resident status. And so that's why we thought people who have been here for less than 5 years would be a sort of a sufficient, cap on the demographic.
Terrific. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe you can back up a step for us and just elaborate on why diversity in clinical trials is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that different people respond differently to drugs, treatments, interventions, vaccines, whatever have you. And this is because of different genetic factors, environmental, lifestyle factors. So the safety and efficacy of drugs largely depends on age, your race, your ethnicity, gender, and sex, among other factors. And so if you don't have appropriate representation from diverse groups of people, the results and findings of your trials cannot be as broadly translated across all demographics. And it's also important to note beyond this that diversity in clinical trials is also a very critical step because it combats health disparities and promotes health equity. And just to kind of give you, in very layman's terms, the definition of what I mean by health equity. So, health equity is basically no matter who you are and no matter where you come from, that you have the same opportunity as everyone else to access and to benefit from healthcare services and to achieve the highest level of health that you can achieve. And so that's health equity. Now, in the context of clinical trials, what health equity means is that participants in your clinical trials reflect the group of people who are most likely to have the health condition that your trial is testing a treatment for. They are most likely to need that treatment that your trial is testing and are going to be able to access the treatment once your trial is complete and the treatment becomes available. So having diverse groups of people participate in your clinical trials basically improves health equity.
So what happens when there's a lack of diverse participation? How does are the results affected, and if so, how?
Yeah, so when clinical trials lack diverse participation. As you can imagine, the results probably do not accurately then reflect how treatments are going to work across different populations. There might be different side effects or unforeseen challenges that the drugs may have. So it may not be as safe or as effective for everybody. So like you said, the generalizability of your trial results are then limited.
So why the new immigrant community? We've discussed your background. You've been here for quite some time in Canada after coming from the US. Why is this important to the discussion?
Yeah. So the new immigrant community, including refugees and asylum seekers, is really important in this context because, as you can imagine, they bring unique lived experiences. And these experiences may expose them to significant physical and mental health challenges that might need more attention. Pre-migration, there might be trauma due to conflict, displacement, a lot of other factors. Then there's post-migration stressors, which we'll talk about in a second. That puts these individuals at an increased risk for developing physical or mental health challenges. For example, we do know that refugees are often exposed to injury, abuse, and trauma pre-migration. And all of these challenges may benefit from specialized attention in clinical trials.
So I imagine that post-stress that you referred to is one of the key barriers that immigrants face in participating in clinical trials. I had not thought of that. I had thought about once they're here, life
Yes,
is good. But
yes,
what
yes.
what are some of the other barriers that new immigrants face in participating in clinical trials?
Yeah, so there's something called just to kind of step back for a second. There's something called the healthy immigrant effect, and research basically shows that those individuals who come to Canada uh, are usually in better health when they come, and then it declines over time. And we also know that new immigrants or newcomers to Canada are less likely to utilize primary and preventative healthcare services than Canadian-born counterparts. And this is due to lots of different factors. So you asked about barriers. There's geography, there's language, there's culture, there's logistical barriers, financial constraints, a lot of different things. So um, to kind of, set the context. So through my work with N2 Canada, we were awarded a federal grant last year to hold a community conversation with the new immigrant population. And so we held this workshop at a public community center in Toronto last year. And through our conversation with the new immigrants who attended the workshop, we were able to kind of gain a lot of very valuable sort of insights. And so when we talk about barriers, let's just start from the beginning. So the very first thing, where do you go to learn about research options? Where do you go to educate yourself, to increase your awareness of clinical trials, what they are, where are they available, who are they for? If we think about that step, even at that point in time, this particular population is facing a lot of challenges. So the first thing that we heard was, as a new immigrant, I'm already navigating a lot of different websites, a lot of different portals to try to settle myself, to try to set up my, different services that I need as a newcomer. And so the last thing that I need is to go to another website to learn about clinical trials and about what they are and what those options look like. And so all of the attendees at that workshop really stated a preference for having face-to-face interactions with researchers and research teams and learning about clinical trials in group settings, in community settings, so trusted venues where they frequent anyway, they're very familiar with that. They would have more of a preference to learn about clinical trials that way, as opposed to online sort of websites, etc. So that's the first thing. There's barriers there. The other thing too is that as a newcomer, you're already struggling to find, probably a family doctor. You're already struggling to find maybe other, services and to access those services. And so navigating the healthcare system can be quite a harrowing task for newcomers. And so in the midst of all of that, to try and identify clinical trials or research options, or to even learn about what research is really like the lowest priority for these individuals. So it's even more important than for people like us who are conducting clinical trials to try to bridge that gap, to try to navigate, to help this population navigate clinical trials and clinical trial options in a much easier way. And like I said, the attendees from that workshop were very clear in what they preferred and how they preferred to be gaining the awareness. Then there's questions around trust, and that's a very, very big issue that comes up when we talk about barriers. Now, we heard questions like, is randomization really random? Am I going to be assigned to the placebo group on purpose? Maybe not randomly. Maybe maybe the doctor is being paid to conduct the trial. You have to recognize that there's a lot of countries around the world where healthcare is privatized and citizens have to pay to access healthcare. And in that context, then, if a doctor or an institution is conducting research, it's understood in a way that they're also being paid by maybe the drug company to run the trial or to coordinate with them or collaborate with them. And in that sense, then patients are not necessarily trusting the physician because they're thinking, well, they're paid to enroll me in the trial. And so it's in their best interest to get me into the trial, not in my best interest. And then what happens if I don't do well on the trial? What if I have adverse events? Are they really going to be following up? Because they probably don't want to take me out of the trial, right? So there's trust issues like that. Then there's trust around your data and information. So I'll give you an example. When we were promoting and marketing the flyer for our workshop, we were talking about come and learn about clinical research, about medical research, etc. So there was a lot of misunderstanding about that. A lot of people thought that we're going to be conducting like medical tests, during this workshop. We're going to actually take blood. And then where are the results going to go? Why are we collecting this information? The other piece was at the end of the workshop, we had gift cards to compensate and, to just as a token of our gratitude for people to come and to take the time to talk to us. And in order to give them the gift cards, we had to note down like some very basic contact information just for auditing purposes, right? And there was a lot of hesitancy in sharing their contact information because there wasn't a lot of understanding, I guess, in terms of like what would be done with that contact information. And some of these individuals were here on refugee status or were asylum seekers. And so there's a lot of trust, mistrust, sorry, in the research system as it is. And so that was one of the bigger issues. And then there's language barriers, as you can imagine. There's logistical barriers. People are busy with work, financial barriers, a lot of different types of contexts.
A word that you didn't say, but it keeps on coming to my head is self-advocacy. I don't know how much, because I haven't been through the process of trying to find clinical trials, although friends near and dear to me have. When you ask the question, where do you go? For me, living here all of my life, that would be a daunting question. But for somebody who's trying to set up a new life and all of the paperwork and all of the portals and trying to find a family doctor, that is a significant challenge. I mean, I think every day people are a little bit hesitant to trust pharmaceutical companies. So to answer the question of where do you go beyond your family doctor, where do people go to find that out? Is there is there one source where you can say, I heard about this trial, is it legitimate? Where do people go?
Yeah, so
How do I
that's a
find out about these
yeah,
trials? Like, can I put down, this is what I have, what
yeah.
and when is happening? Yeah.
Yeah. So now the thing is, there's a twofold sort of issue, right? The first thing is, where do you go to find the trials? The second piece is, do you do you trust the system enough? Do you trust the trials, the trial lists, the research teams? So if you're simply looking for options, there's a lot of different websites. Like I said, there's a lot of different databases and portals that connect people. N2 Canada has a public facing website called itstartswithme.ca. And there's a lot of good information there for people who are being introduced to the concept of clinical trials and what is it, and sort of like the frequently asked and commonly asked questions are all on there. But this is what I'm saying, is that when we were at our workshop, for example, we did have a plan to have these attendees take a look at our website and just give us some user feedback. Are their questions answered? Do they feel like the language is simple enough for them to understand? And nobody was interested in looking at yet another website. That's what they said. They said, we're up to here, with our portals and our navigation through different, services that are all online, and trying to settle in as a new Canadian. It's very difficult already. We don't want to go to another website that we don't even know who's put up, and what kind of information is on there. Whose interest is it to relay that information to us, right? And so the preference was, like you said, so then how do they find out? Their preference is for researchers to come to them, in community centers, in community settings where they are already very familiar, and they trust those venues. They are in group settings with their peers, so they feel safe. And then for researchers to talk to them about what research is and answer their questions. That is what they said would make them feel comfortable and safe around clinical trials.
So that sounds like a great strategy to bring it out to the community centers. And go and find those participants. But are you just relying on people who happen to be there that day? How can community involvement and patient advocacy play a bigger role in building that trust for
Yeah, yeah.
this
Well,
population?
exactly. So it can play a bigger role. It must play a bigger role. Trust is something that happens one step at a time, right? So it's not overnight. Researchers, I think research teams really need to get out of their comfort zone, partner in a meaningful way with communities and community leaders, community advocates, patient partners, etc. And it has to be a two-way street. So it can't be, okay, I have a clinical trial, I have a project that looks at this in so and so population. All right, well, let me go and find out, where does this population usually gather culturally or in a faith-based venue, perhaps. Let me go out to the community and talk to them about my project. Let me gather the data that I need to gather, and let me go home and never see them again. That is exactly what happens majority of the time when we talk about community engagement, is that researchers have a motive for why they need to go out and create a relationship with this particular community. It's because they want data from them. And then they never go back. They never close the loop. Those individuals who participated that particular session or feedback, etc., are never given the closure. What happened with your study? What happened with my data? Did you publish it? What were the findings? So that doesn't happen. So what we need to do is we need to create this two-way street in a more meaningful way, and create sustainable partnerships, right? That takes time, that takes energy, that takes resources, that takes several line items in your budget for when you're planning a clinical trial. And so now I think more and more people are starting to see it that way, but we have ways to go still.
You're talking now at a very macro level about these two-way streets and partnerships. And there needs to be infrastructure, if we want to call it, in place to support that. But when it comes to building trust, I think it does boil down to the interpersonal interactions between the researchers and the diverse populations. So if, you know, we have some researchers here with us today, or they're watching us later during the recording, what training or practice would you recommend to improve researchers' interactions with diverse populations?
Yeah. So you mentioned, that I'm talking about it at a macro level. On a micro level, team by team, researcher by researcher, project by project, I think one of the things that we should be doing and looking at is to enroll sort of patient ambassadors in our projects as well, in our teams as well. Those individuals who have similar lived experiences as your target population for your project, so that that individual can become sort of an ambassador for you. That helps build trust with communities as well. So if you have somebody who is also so and so, and then goes out and speaks to their own community, their own people on your behalf, that's going to help foster trust and reduce hesitancy. In terms of trainings, cultural competence training is key. So in this diverse landscape that we have, the multicultural landscape in Canada, we are always interacting, whether it's within our own research teams or whether it's with the patients and their caregivers and their families, we are going to be interacting with individuals who come from diverse racial and ethnic cultural backgrounds. And so it's really important for us to recognize how to behave appropriately, how to interact and speak appropriately. And that's all encompassed within cultural competency skills. And N2 Canada has actually recently launched a course, which is the first of its kind in Canada, and it's specifically geared towards clinical research professionals in cultural competency skills in clinical research. And it gives you those examples of clinical research settings, and then how to interact and how to approach conversations with curiosity and respect and humility. So that's key. That's first.
Yeah. Sorry, I
Um,
cut you off there a bit with my
no,
excitement about the course, which
no,
I think is free too, isn't it?
it's free for all of the N2 membership, and
Okay.
McMaster is part of N2 as well.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem at all. So cultural competence training, and then I think beyond that, also just like I said, taking the time to interact with individuals in a culturally appropriate way, whether that means taking some money out of your budget to translate materials into different languages in a culturally appropriate manner so that those trial materials are more accessible to broader communities, to broader populations. It could also mean that you have linguistically matching staff that interact with participants from various language communities and cultures, etc. All of these will help bridge the gap and foster trust.
Yeah, and a lot of those things that you're talking about to either acquire or upskill current staff into learning new languages takes time, and resource investment. So we're talking about, you know, planning and things that will take time to improve the system. So communication when we're not using the same first language is obviously a significant challenge to engage participants. What methods have you found that work best, or perhaps there's a combination when we're thinking of face-to-face outreach, translated materials, you know, how would you approach building that communication strategy for your local area in which you're whatever that local area may be targeting your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, for community engagement, face-to-face, community-based settings where possible for research teams. For participant engagement, when approaching patients, I think we really should look to have some materials that are translated in a culturally appropriate manner, so that it's broader, wider reach of your project. These things are difficult to do. I recognize fully that they are heavy on the budget and not so easy to do, not so easy to validate as well. So I totally get that, but we must start that work. And then, like I said, let's look to leverage the diversity that we have in our workforce to be able to interpret perhaps in a culturally appropriate manner for our patients, as opposed to excluding them outright just because English is not their first language. And if we plan it properly, it can be done.
I think it's important to ask the question of you, what is the call to action? What is the call to action in terms of next steps to bridge the gap in immigrant participation in clinical trials? What's our next step?
Right. So first and foremost, I think more awareness is needed about why inclusion of this group is critical. There's unique needs and lived experiences that this population brings, and I think those are very valuable to embed and include in clinical trials. Cultural competence training is a must for research teams. Like I said, in this day and age, in the landscape that we are living in, it's an absolute must-have. And the conversations must continue. So the community consultation that we did last year, we're hoping to continue those types of conversations. We had them with the new immigrant community in Toronto, but there are, of course, lots of new immigrants that are settled across various cities and towns in Canada. And so we want these conversations to continue. And we also want to advocate for an infrastructure so that it's easier for researchers and research teams to have the time and the resources to do meaningful community engagement. And these things, of course, take time, and some of these are things that you could do today, and some are things that are going to require a lot of collaboration on a higher level. But we must have the intent.
Yeah, intent is where it all starts, truly, with a little bit of planning too, as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for what you've brought to us today. I'm just going to switch over back to the slides for a moment. I'd like to walk everyone through the online applied clinical research program we offer at McMaster University. This program is 100% online and is designed for individuals seeking to enter the field of clinical research. Program content is based on the knowledge and skills for clinical research associates and managers as identified by the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, ACRP, and the Society of Clinical Research Associates, which is commonly referred to as SOCRA. There is a list of items that you'll be learning about in this program, but Mananza, I'm going to ask you in a moment, since you have been teaching in so many of these courses and helped design this program, if there's, any golden nuggets you'd like to say about the program.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, are you asking me right now? Or would you like me to wait?
Sure, if you're ready right now. I was going to give you a minute, but I know you're always good to go. So please let us know what you think.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, this is going to be my 7th year now teaching in the program, and I've pretty much, I think, taught all of the courses over the years. And one of the things that I say to everybody who's looking to explore a certificate or has already joined the program is that the program is built in such a way that it honestly mirrors a lot of your real life sort of scenario and experiences as a professional once you complete the program and you go out into the field. So I think you're going to honestly be more better prepared, I think. And I think that your journey into a career in clinical research begins as soon as you start the program, to be very honest. But I think that the content reflects real life knowledge and practical knowledge to such a degree that you've honestly almost gained, on the job experience while you're still in the courses. That's my 2 cents. And I'm not just saying that because I'm part of the program, but honestly feel this way.
That's great, Mananza. As I mentioned before, the program is completely online. There's 5 courses. Most people are taking 3 years to complete the program, 1 course at a time. You can speed that up a little bit if you wish. But we really encourage you to, make the most of your time here. There is a clinical research capstone that enables you to really provide you some real life experience. Thank you for joining us today. If there's anything else that comes to mind after you leave us today, don't hesitate to drop us an email or look us up on the website. And please, if you haven't already registered for this session, please do so we can get you all that good information that we've promised. Thanks for attending, everyone, and thank you to Mananza.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.